Just a note at the top. This episode does contain some very brief use of expletives. This episode also briefly touches on themes of violence, historic hate crimes, and murder. This is The Fall Line. This season, we're covering cold cases in Atlanta, Chicago, and Montana. We're beginning the season with a special interview with CBC's David Ridgen, a documentarian and podcaster who's just released the 9th season of his acclaimed podcast, Someone Knows Something. The CBC describes David as, quote, an award-winning podcaster, filmmaker, and writer who specializes in hard-hitting, character-driven stories with a passion for investigative work and narrative experimentation. As host, producer, and writer of CBC's Someone Knows Something, Ridgen works alongside the family of cold case victims to discover new leads and evidence, trying to put the ghosts of the past to rest. And we think that's a pretty great description of the work that Ridgen does. As people who work on underserved cold cases, we consider David Ridgen's productions to be one of the best examples of what podcasting can do for cold cases, for families, and for victims. His commitment to ethical and compassionate storytelling has remained constant in every season of Someone Knows Something. Now in Season 9, which premiered on November 5th, Ridgen is presenting a story that he has a direct connection to. As CBC puts it, the, quote, investigation is 15 years in the making and follows the story of Ontario teenager Christine Harron, who disappears in 1993. A mysterious man confesses to her murder, but the police case stalls out. And then David steps in. Christine Harron was just 15 years old when she disappeared. Her family waited for years for some movement in her case, and when it looked like there would finally be some forward motion towards resolution, things fell apart at the judicial stage. David Ridgen first released a short documentary on Christine's case back in 2012. Titled Confession to Murder, it premiered on the CBC, and it set into motion a series of events that are still ongoing today. In the newest season of Someone Knows Something, Ridgen ties together the stages of his work, his initial investigative reporting, the documentary, and the current podcast, with the through line of his relationship with Christine's mother, Marianne. Their work together changes not only the outcome of a decades-old cold case, but also highlights the shifting relationship that Christine's family has with law enforcement, the judicial system, and their own emotions. Frustration, grief, and the knowledge that no matter how many answers they get, they're never going to know enough. We sat down with David Ridgen this October to talk about Christine's case, his work on the latest season of Someone Knows Something, and his approach to his craft. We were able to listen to the new season in its entirety prior to release, and we cannot recommend it highly enough. Be sure to subscribe as soon as you're done listening to this interview. By the time you hear this, Season 9 will be in its second week of release. So, could you tell me about Christine Harron?
Christine was 15. She was rebellious. She didn't like school, but she enjoyed her walks outside in the natural world, loved reading. She loved being around children. She was 15 years old on May 18th, 1993, when she disappeared from Hanover, Ontario. And on the morning of that day, Chrissy, as her mom calls her, Chrissy, hadn't felt well. She also didn't like school anyway, so she stayed home with her mother, whose name is Marianne. And Marianne and Chrissy argued a bit that day. This is May 18th, 1993. Eventually, a truant officer from the school apparently called, "Where's Chrissy?" So by that time, around 1 p.m, Chrissy slammed the door, allegedly on her way to school, and Marianne watched her walk down the street, turn the corner, and that was the last she ever saw of her.
And when I was first looking into this case, I had a few questions just as a Southern American, such a different sort of setting for me. And I'd love to hear just a little bit more about the area where Christine lived. Did they see many serious crimes, homicide investigations? Is the OPP similar to a state police force in the U.S.?
Right. The town of Hanover in Ontario is in southwestern Ontario, the province up here in Canada where I live and where Chrissy lived. Population of Hanover is about 8,000 right now, and probably not much different at the time in 1993. And Hanover came into being originally as a result of immigration from Germany and other European spots, largely. And at the time, I guess back in the day, kind of before before Chrissy disappeared, Hanover was a major furniture making powerhouse in North America, actually. It was one of the great furniture manufacturing areas, apparently. But eventually, much of that business went overseas to China, elsewhere. And at the time of Chrissy's disappearance, there were a few companies in the town. There's a company called Dickies, a clothing company you might know. I'm not sure if they actually manufactured at the time, but they certainly had an outlet there. But it was kind of a faded glory small town, southern Ontario, which is an agricultural area generally. And nevertheless, this is the place that Chrissy called home, Hanover, Ontario. In terms of policing, Ontario has a few different police forces. There's city and town forces for some municipalities, and the Ontario Provincial Police, or the OPP, for everything else. And the OPP is the largest police force in Ontario and one of the largest in the country. And it's grown recently, actually last 20 years a bit, by taking over some of the policing in smaller areas from local police. And this is the case in Hanover. Hanover had a local police force at the time, which was, made up of a small department of I'm not sure how many people that were just Hanover-based small town police force. But then the OPP started moving into these smaller communities, and eventually Chrissy's case was taken over by the Ontario Provincial Police. So the case was handled by at least two forces here, which is always something to look at in cases. So there's often a switcheroo that happens, and in general, police detectives aren't around for more than 3 or 4 years at a time anyway. So cases pass hands and they pass between forces. So I would say the OPP is most similar to state police in the US, but they cover a wide variety of tasks.
That was one of the things that first struck me when I heard about Chrissy's case, and the other was just how long you had been following it. How did you first find out about her case?
Well, I'm a documentary filmmaker, and that should be pointed out first. And I've been looking at these cold cases since 2004, really, if I was going to count the years. And at the time I found out about Chrissy's case, I was developing some television documentaries for Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, the CBC, which is a public broadcaster up here in Canada, in the late 2000s. So I was developing TV programs, documentaries about cold cases. And I recall Chrissy's case made the shortlist right away for several reasons. I attended a memorial service for her in Hanover just to do some initial research. It's a probably 3.5-hour drive from Toronto, where I live. There was something about the service at this church, her church, that she used to go to. Her photo was there. I had not met the parents yet, her mother anyways. Her father was not on the scene. How people spoke about her, the minister, maybe just want to try to help her, a rebellious person, loved nature, hated school, did her own thing. And I remember saying to the associate producer who was there at the time with me that Chrissy was someone I wish that we had been able to meet. And I remember feeling that kind of, I guess, not anger, but that heat of frustration about her case. And maybe I could help. It kind of motivated me to look more into her case.
And when you began to look into her case further, what struck you as a really immediate place to start your investigative reporting?
Well, a good reason to look at any case is because nobody's touched it. This is a case that, for some odd reason, nobody had looked at in terms of sort of post-police work. Literally, there's a mountain of information available in archives and at the police station, and nobody knew about it, including Chrissy's family. So another good reason was that there seemed to be a suspect in this case. There had been a trial that had failed, and I wanted to know all about what that was about and help Marianne, Chrissy's mother, learn about all this at the same time. So part of the process is to work with family members. I always work with family members in their victims' family members in these cases and try to help them confront these cases in ways that they have not been able to before in order to help them. And we can talk about that later. But so Marianne was game. I would never have looked at the case without her consent. And I would never have looked at the case without her direct participation. And she agreed, and we went forward.
So on that point, in terms of your approach to how you do things, you always include victims' family members as part of your process. Why is that essential to you?
Yeah, I always work with family members on my cases. And if there isn't a family member, then a close friend, somebody who has a connection to the case, has a stake in the case, has something that the trauma and the loss has affected them deeply in ways that I think they could be helped through those through the process of Someone Knows Something, or the processes I lead them through or help facilitate or kind of partner with them, is kind of a healing process. So I always refer to Someone Knows Something as not a true crime show, really. It's more like a self-help show, a self-healing show. Because I think confronting these things, confronting those dark places is a healing process. And I think that it's always worked that way. In the cases I've worked on, the family members I've worked with tell me that. I can see it as plain as day, the changes that people go through. I learn as much from them as I think they probably learn from the cases. And these are long processes. It's not like I'm sort of a quick news reporter. I'm there for a week and then it's like, see you later. I've been working on this case for 15 years, the case of Christine Harron, and it's not over yet, even though it seems maybe to be over. So I think it's a self-help kind of process, and that's part of it. And it's kind of proof against exploitation as well. There's a lot of leveling of true crime. People are exploitative, and a lot of them are. A lot of these anthology shows that look at a crime a day or a crime a week are kind of exploitative, I would argue, and ones that aren't actually revealing anything new about cases, but just kind of re-summarizing what's already happened or what other people have done. Sometimes, a broken telephone can happen, and you can actually damage cases by kind of continuing to repeat information that's been Googled, or combined from other people's research. So you may have experienced this. My research and my work is often regurgitated in other people's podcasts. And I hear all this stuff coming at me about other cases and the cases I've worked on, and the information I'm hearing back has been conflated with some psychic's information or something. And it becomes this kind of junk case, right? And you can actually damage cases, and you can really hurt families by regurgitating this stuff. And there's a lot of it out there, isn't there? I don't know that there's a lot of people that are actually working on the cases in the long form, and the ones that do, I have a lot of respect for.
Just before the break, David was discussing the relative rarity in this field of working on cases in the long form, for years at a time, and with families, and the different kind of both relationships and productions that result. We pick back up that discussion here. I think that's really clear when one listens to a full season of Someone Knows Something, start to finish, like I just did with your new season. And you see the process of a family member working through something. And I think that was actually particularly highlighted when another reporter, I believe, spoke with Marianne during the series about the concept of closure. And this is something that comes up again and again for us with families that we work with, because closure is such a heavy word. And it's something that you actually took a moment to highlight and discuss on the podcast itself. And I think it really kind of shows the difference between pat true crime and, like you said, these difficult discussions we need to have about, is there a beginning, is there an end, is there ever really resolution per se. So in terms of that concept of closure, I'd love to hear what that even means to you now after so many years of working on this, and what it means, since it can be such a loaded word for families.
I think closure is a media concept. I really think that it's a way to perform episodes of some kind of content production so that they make sense within a short period of time. And we can have a beginning and a middle and an end, which is a great screenplay format as well. We have a definitive ending with the concept of closure, which I think is bullshit. I think closure is bullshit. And I think most family members I've worked with believe that closure doesn't exist. As a concept, you can continue to talk about something that helps you find a way to end a process. But in our lives are a continuum. Everybody experiences trauma. I mean, everybody has relatives that pass away. We pass away. And there's a continuum, there's a spectrum that we're on that deals with this trauma. Victims of crime have a different kind of trauma, I would argue, than just kind of, my dad died or something. I'm not going to reorganize my whole life around looking at, for example, say my father passed away, he was 95. I'm not going to reorganize my whole life trying to figure out why, why he died, or what the answer, what happened to him. Whereas a victim of crime, a victim of a sudden murder or disappearance who does not have say, the body of their child or know where their child is, it completely changes their life upside down, and they reorient their entire being around solving this case. They can't have fun until it's solved. They can't live until it's solved. Everything is based on trying to get that information. So closure, I think, is used as a way to sort of tidy up the ends of cases, or so-called ending of cases. I've worked on a case where we found the person who did it. We found the persons who did it. This is season 3, for example, where I worked in Mississippi on a Klan murder of 2 African Americans, Henry D. and Charles Moore, 1964, civil rights era murder. We found the people who helped to kill and conceive of the murder of these 2 guys. A horrible, horrible, brutal Klan murder. We found them, initiated a process that led to the trial. The brother of Charles Moore and I continued to work on the case until there was a conviction. After the conviction, this is years between these periods, Thomas Moore and I returned to Mississippi several times. On one of those journeys, there was a forgiveness process going on between him and one of the Klansmen who helped to kill his brother. And this is, fast forward another couple of years, he's in the church singing with a Klan-built church with this Klansman singing America 'Tis of Thee with him, next to him. I mean, and I'm still working with Thomas. Some of the interviews I did with Klansmen with Thomas had information about other cases. And when you do interviews with people and they're free with their words, they can talk about lots of different things. You're focused on one case, this case, Charles Moore and Henry D. But now that that's over, we have all this other information that we gathered at the same time. So now we have information gathered by now deceased Klansmen who we're talking about other cases. And so it's just ongoing. Thomas and I still have a relationship. I talk to him every month and it never ends. Like there's no closure. Thomas has opened up over the period of time. He has changed from pushing people away. He has changed from always enclosing himself in this mantle of guilt for why wasn't I there when Charles disappeared. He's gone from that to being a much happier outward person. And that's not closure, though. That's just change in that continuum.
Just a heads up here. Though Christine's case and David's involvement in it have been covered in the media for a number of years, we're about to discuss some details that might spoil the podcast. If you'd like to wait until you hear Someone Knows Something Season 9 to learn what David discovered, you'll want to skip ahead about 6 minutes or until you hear the next ad break. Even if you listen, though, there are still plenty of details that David does not share with us here that will be in the podcast. Season 9 is really an incredible listen. On that note, in the next part of our interview, we talk about the impact that David's work had on Christine's case. And it's interesting because you said earlier on when we were speaking that Christine's case is still ongoing too, although we do know that her killer is behind bars as a result of the investigation, and at least partly because of your work. So I'm really interested to hear a little more about your take on how that work is still ongoing today.
Part of the reason I was intrigued with Chrissy's case is because there appeared to be a suspect, and not one that the police had found. Up until August of 2004, and remember, Chrissy disappeared in May of 93, police had no idea what happened to Chrissy. And remember, this would be 11 years before. So in August 2004, at a party with his family members, a man aged 35 at the time, near the end of the evening, after some drinks and some kind of upset with his family, started telling people that he had killed Christine Harron. And this guy picked up the phone and dialed 911. He hung up. But the police responded anyway, based on a hang-up call. Police will respond often on 911 hang-ups. So this man, upon the arrival of the police, the man walks down the stairs and confesses to this cop who came that he had killed Christine Harron. Chrissy. He doesn't say Chrissy, he says Christine Harron, to this responding officer. And he said he could show police where he left her. And at the time, 11 years earlier, when Chrissy disappeared, this guy would have been 24 years old, and his name was Anthony Edward Ringel. Anthony Ringel was born on December 10th, 1968, one of 6 children. He's about 5 or thereabouts, kind of blunt features with long, thinning brown hair. He worked at a local Canadian Tire, which is like a hardware store up here, but was unemployed in May 1993, the time of Chrissy's disappearance. And when I met him, he was living between locations, between a family member's house and a local trailer park. So anyway, speeding up the story a little bit here so that you can get to my podcast and listen to it. Ringo goes through the stages of what would have been a murder trial in 2006. After this confession, he's taken to the police station, etc., put in jail and awaits trial. But in 2006, the judge throws the case out, basically, because of police mistakes. The case is stayed for a year, but Ringo is freed and nothing new happens. So it just ends. Like when a case is stayed, if no new information comes forward in a year, it just ends. So Anthony at this time lived in the same area. Nobody did anything. No reporter talks to him. No police action can be seen to be happening. This is 2006. So I had 3 more years, and then I come on the scene in 2009, begin working with Chrissy's mom, Marianne. Police barely assist me, but and possibly for reasons that will become clear. But regardless, I'm able to recover or uncover many court files and investigative documents from archives, from police, through court orders, from the case. And Marianne, the mother, for the first time, learns what actually happened through this process. Why did the case fail? And she also learns some of what Anthony said at the time, Anthony Ringo. And then we go from there. And remember, this is for television, so I'm shooting this myself with my cameras for TV as a documentarian. Marianne working with me the whole time. She's very brave throughout this process, confronting the murder of her daughter for the first time. And I find out where Anthony is. And Marianne and I go to try to speak to him together. But that scenario plays out differently than we'd planned, and we can hear that in the podcast. And then I go to try to speak to him myself. And I do meet with Anthony on a cold knock doorstep at his trailer, in his trailer park, and we speak for a long time. And I ask him some very direct and pointed questions. Did you kill Christine, etc.? So then all of that information about the case, the court drama, the police malfeasance, talking to Ringo and other people, all on camera, goes into this 20-minute TV documentary made for CBC, and it goes to air across the country, across Canada, in the spring of 2012. Shortly after my documentary goes to air, police start an undercover operation on Anthony Ringo in the same trailer park where I met him. And the podcast tells this whole story too, and then picks up where the TV show left off and tells the rest of the tale of how it all happened. And yes, it's a story that shows directly how the work Marianne and I did is literally used by police so that they can, again, arrest Anthony Ringo in February 2013. Except this time, when he's arrested, the trial goes forward in 2016, and Anthony Ringo is convicted at that trial and is now serving a life sentence here in Ontario in a federal penitentiary for second-degree murder of Christine Harron. And I guess, the obvious point is that the full story of it's in season 9 of Someone Knows Something. I think it's pretty amazing, actually. If I have to say something that's about the work did its job.
It was so interesting to me to listen to this season, and I think it might be one of my favorite seasons of Someone Knows Something. I've listened to all of them because I got to see work that you began so long ago be presented now, and the 2 different pieces of media coming together. But what made you decide to tell this story now in season 9? Was there a particular reason that came up for you? It just felt right to tell it now?
Yeah, this is a case that the information has always been seemingly out of the public eye. Nobody knew anything about what happened in the first iteration of the case when Anthony Ringo came forward. Nobody really knew anything about the original investigation. Nobody knew what happened, why the case fell apart. So that first iteration of the process, the TV version, was made to get that information out and to take Marianne through that process. And the continuation of that is the podcast era, which then tells the story of the other part of the story that nobody knew anything about. Nobody had really published anything about the case, even after he was arrested the second time, Anthony. And I'm not really certain why that's the case. So the reason to go forward now is just to, as it was before, is to continue with Marianne, digging this information up, telling the story for the first time of what happened. And through that process, maybe we can find Chrissy. And that process is ongoing.
This is now the 9th season of Someone Knows Something. What, if anything, has changed for you since season 1? Do you still have the same approach to storytelling 9 seasons later? You've covered a variety of cases. What's drawing you to the cases? Are they still the same sorts of cases?
I'm actually shocked when I go back and listen to historic, what I would now call historic, sort of stuff I've worked on back in the day on camera, and then listen to myself with the miking that I do now for SKS. I sound almost identical to myself. Like the approach, the way I behave, I don't know how much I've changed. I don't know if that's a bad thing. I don't really know that I've changed a lot about the approach or how I do things. I think that the approach is the same. Working with family, everybody's different. Every case is different. All the situations are different. The strategies of how to go about solving the case are different. But the core backbone of working with family to sort of address or confront directly these things with them is the same. Long form working with them and on the case is the same. I don't share everything with family members. It's not like we sit and go over every single aspect of every case. And they know that before we start. I can't share everything from interviews that I learn. Every interview I do, I don't go back and kind of give them the transcript of it. Partly because that's not investigatively correct. You don't want any information that you have gotten being seeded throughout the community. So I don't want to tell a family member, oh yeah, Bill said this, this, and this, and then have that family member, a month later be talking to somebody and say, yeah, Bill's apparently said this, this, and this to David. And then I go to interview somebody that talked to that person who heard that Bill said this, this, and this, and it's broken telephone. I seed the community with my interviews if I start telling people what I did with them, and it's a broken telephone interview. So then that's how you start rumors, and that's how you ruin cases. So I have to be quiet about how much I'm learning about various things with anybody, even family members. But I do share some things with family that I won't share with anybody else, and we go forward with that. And that's not changed. That's something that hasn't changed. I'm the same kind of vault on that front when it comes to anybody. And I don't think it's changed in how I look at cases, in the process of gathering, in the process of being in the field, gathering the tape, looking for archival resources, court orders to police, access to information requests. These are all part of the process. I'm not sure other podcasters go through the lengths, and I'm not sure I need to go through all these lengths, to some extent, but I do. I've got, boxes and boxes and boxes of this stuff. And around me in the room where I sleep, I've got the walls are lined with banker boxes of stuff and pages of stuff, which I'm now scanning and digitizing because it's just too much stuff. I don't throw anything away, including any tape I've ever shot or recorded. So it's just gathering.
After working on this season and revisiting your own work from, 10 years ago or so, is there something that struck you as particularly meaningful that you'd also like audiences to take away from this season?
I think this season 9 of Someone Knows Something, the 9th season, wow, God, I feel old. But anyway, I think in general across SKS, I'd like people to just take away that you can't get information unless you give information. You have to create the space for people to want to speak. And to do that, you have to make that space open enough that they will talk. And people need to talk. People need to get this information out, or some information they have. It doesn't have to be a cold case. People need to have space made for them to speak. And to do that, there has to be kind of a mutual respect going on. I mean, even if you're talking to a perpetrator, I've said in other interviews, you have to love everybody you interview. And I think that is true. And in this case, it was particularly difficult for me to adhere to that in season 9. And for listeners, they'll understand what I'm talking about. But I still think that space has to be made available so that we can learn the truth of things. And I think that space is also important in everything we're seeing going on in the world today. And, I don't want to get too friggin' lump in the throaty about it, nor sort of, I'm going to solve the world's problems through SKS or whatever. But I just think if we're going to talk about things, I think that space is important in order that we talk about it.
Okay, so someone told me this would be an interesting thing to ask you, so I'm pretty interested to hear the answer.
Tell me who that someone was.
A little birdie at CBC.
God, Cecil probably. Anyway.
So, I was told that you became interested in storytelling at a very early age, and that I should perhaps ask you to tell me just a little bit about something called Dave's Honesty Hour, which may have begun in elementary school.
Yeah, Dave's Honesty Hour. So I am the progenitor of the story because it is true, and I've told this story at conferences. Dave's Honesty Hour is a true story. And there are two Daves involved. Another friend of mine named Dave also was involved in this, but I'll take the credit largely. He won't mind. So it was high school. So it wasn't elementary school where this was kind of developed. And I think it's par for the course in the 80s, kind of breakfast clubby type stuff going on. People probably don't even know what that film is that are listening, some of them. But this kind of concept that at parties you could get into a dark room together and kind of tell people something that you hadn't ever told anybody before started to happen. And it wasn't just drunk kind of, let's go in the other room and talk. There was a whole sort of announcement, okay, it's Dave's Honesty Hour. And we would go into a dark room, sit in a circle. And this would be people that had never spoken to each other, like there's still these kind of stratifications that happened in high school and kind of cliquey type things. And these are people that traditionally wouldn't associate in some ways, all sitting in the same circle. And the process was just basically one at a time, go around the room in the dark and say something that you had always wanted to say or had never told anybody before. And some of the stuff that came out was pretty fantastic and actually incredible. Some of it was disturbing. Some of it was filthy and disgusting, but some of it was also hilarious. And it was just, some of that stuff has stuck with me, and I have not told those stories. It was all built around this, we are vaults in this room, we'll never tell anybody, and we'll never mention it again. So it wasn't something that was like, you go up to them in the hallway and say, oh, I remember when you told me about that. It was said in that room, and it stayed in, there's like a cone of silence in there. But anyway, it was something that kind of stuck around for a while at these gatherings that I would be at. And I think I kind of got a kick out of it a bit. I don't know if that's weird, but getting people to talk, making a space open that people could be as honest as they possibly could and say things that they never would feel comfortable having said, in other circumstances. And I trace a little bit of SKS roots actually back to that, or just even my interest in documentation and documenting things in film and other ways. So that's Dave's Honesty Hour.
I think that makes a hell of a lot of sense for anyone who works in storytelling and with helping other people tell stories. Well, thank you so much for taking time to speak with us. I know that you are a busy person, and I really hope that our entire audience takes time to listen to the newest season of Someone Knows Something. I listened to the entire thing without stopping in one sitting / walking / moving throughout my household. It was incredible, and I just really appreciate you taking time to talk through it with us a little bit.
Oh, thanks. I appreciate the questions, and nice to talk to you.
You too. Thank you so much. Next time on The Fall Line, we begin our 2-episode coverage of a cold case from our hometown of Atlanta, Georgia. Princella Epps was just 22 years old in July of 1990, and she'd finally moved into an apartment of her own, something her family said that she was thrilled about. She'd only lived in her apartment for about a week when her employer called Princella's mother. She was concerned that Princella hadn't shown up to work. When her parents traveled to her Inman Park studio apartment to check on her, they discovered the unimaginable. And it set into motion a 34-year search for the truth that's been beset by roadblocks, cold leads, communication difficulties, conflicting witness statements, and a lack of media coverage that her family has struggled against. But now, with the help of advocates, an awareness campaign, and new DNA testing on the way, they believe that answers might finally be in sight. If you know of a case that should be covered on The Fall Line, there's a link to our case submission form in the show notes. Thank you for listening. The Fall Line is an independent podcast, and we appreciate listener support. It allows us to do research, obtain FOIA, pay our content advisors, and support and donate to the causes we care about. If you try out the products we advertise, please use our sponsor codes. It really helps. And please take a moment to rate and review our show in your podcast app of choice. And this is important. If you listen on Apple Podcasts, please be sure to check your subscriptions to make sure that you've set to automatic downloads so that you do not miss an episode. My book, Lay Them to Rest, has now been out for a year. It covers years of my life working on a Jane Doe case in the world of forensic scientists who resolve unidentified persons cases. It's out everywhere as hardcover, ebook, and audiobook read by me. You can order it anywhere you get books or through your local library. Find out more in the link in our show notes. If you'd like to support the show and the stories we cover, join us on Patreon or Apple Premium. 100% of our Patreon and Apple Premium earnings are supporting our Family Therapy Fund and actively paying for therapy for families who've appeared on the show. On Patreon, you can get early release ad-free versions of our regular episodes for $5 a month. If you prefer Apple Premium, you can subscribe there as well. On Patreon, we also occasionally post giveaways, updates, and blogs, which all patrons can enjoy, starting at just $1. The Fall Line is written, hosted, and researched by Laurah Norton, with additional research assistance this season by Melissa Gold. Interviews by Brooke Hargrove. Produced, engineered, and scored by Maura Curry. Content advisement by Vic Kennedy and Brandy C. Williams. Special thanks to Liz Lipka.